And whenever you're ready, continue on to biological molecules, the second half of our PowerPoint. A biological molecule is going to be an organic molecule. This means that it contains carbon. These are a very important part of living things. Without them, you would not exist. Biomolecules always contain a carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Sometimes they do contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur as well, but the essential things are the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen. When studying biological molecules, we have two new terms that we have to learn. Luckily, these are based off of something you're probably pretty familiar with. The word mono means how many? One? Correct. The word poly, what does that mean? Many. So mono equals one, poly equals many. Very large molecules are going to be called polymers. These are made up of repeating subunits called monomers. It's a lot like beads on a necklace. The entire necklace is called a polymer. The individual components are called monomers. So every bead is one monomer, two monomer, three monomer, and on. The entire necklace is one polymer. The entire necklace is one polymer. For each of the biological molecules, we're going to identify what a polymer and a monomer is for that specific one. There are 4 types of biological molecules, and it reads a lot like a nutritional label on your favorite food. The first type is fats, otherwise known as lipids. Next up, we have carbohydrates, proteins, and finally, the slightly less known one, nucleic acids. Your body is composed of millions of individual lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids, all working together to keep you running and studying this slide right now. Our first category is the lipids. Lipids are nonpolar, hydrophobic molecules. They hate the water. And because of that, they are essential for our body because they're going to help us to form those barriers and then also to store energy. The fact that they are nonpolar and hate water is what makes them so important. We use these to store energy in a form called triglycerides. Triglycerides, because they're lipids, will not dissolve in water, and we're able to store them in specialized cells called adipose cells. The lipids are forming parts of the cellular membrane, those nonpolar tails on the inside, keeping out the water molecules and allowing our cells to exist. They're also forming parts of our hormones, like cholesterol is going to be a lipid-based hormone. We're going to go in detail on a couple of slides over triglycerides and the phospholipids. Triglycerides are the most common form of lipids in living things. Anyone who has tried to diet is aware of just how many triglycerides you have. Triglycerides are used for long-term energy storage as adipose tissue or fat, structural support, cushioning, and insulation. So we do need these to survive, but when we have too many, there's a little too much cushioning. Now, a triglyceride is going to be made of 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Here's 1, 2, 3. Now, the length of the fatty acid is going to vary. They can be very long or they could be very short. Fatty acids are called either saturated or unsaturated based on the number of double bonds they have. What's a double bond? Well, between this carbon and this carbon, we see one line. That means that there is a single bond between these 2 carbons. One line, another single bond, line, 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 and then what's this? There are two lines connecting these two carbons, and it's also missing those hydrogens that the others had. So this is a double bond. The carbons are bound together by two bonds, not one. So this would be an unsaturated fatty acid. It has at least one double bond. On this one, we only have those single bonds. So this is an unsaturated fatty acid. And here is another one that has that at least one double bond. Then we have the phospholipids. The phospholipids are forming an important part of that cell membrane. They actually form the bulk of it. A phospholipid molecule has a hydrophilic head that is polar and loves water, and a hydrophobic tail that is nonpolar and hates the water. So the nonpolar tail is the one that's formed out of lipids. When you get enough phospholipids together, all of the polar heads will face out towards the water, and all of the nonpolar tails will face inwards towards each other and create a water-free space in the middle. This forms a chemical barrier of cell membranes called the plasma membrane that prevents the water from entering and passing through this membrane. That concludes lipids. Let's go on to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the second building block for the human body. These are sugars used for short-term energy storage. Those lipids were for long-term energy. The sugars, in contrast, are being used up right at that moment, in a few minutes, or in an hour or two, but pretty quick. One monomer of sugar is called a monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide is another word for sugar. The simplest one that we come across is glucose. The most common form of a monosaccharide is glucose. This is a 6-carbon molecule, the primary nutrient that we use for energy. Other types that you see in the body include galactose, fructose, ribose, and deoxyribose, and those all have that ose at the end. So whenever you see ose, you have a pretty good idea you're looking at a carbohydrate. This is an example of a single glucose molecule. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, along with its accompanying hydrogens and oxygens. This is a good example of how a biological molecule is composed primarily of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If you combined 2 monosaccharides, I'll give you a disaccharide. And if we increase that to 3 or more, that is going to be a polysaccharide. Now, a polysaccharide that we'll get to know is called glycogen. Glycogen is when multiple glucose molecules are linked together and used to store glucose in the liver or the muscle cells. The body works by taking that glucose in through your diet. Say you had a big birthday cake, and then they started playing games afterwards. Not a good idea, but some of the games involved races and running. And as you begin to exercise and run, your muscles used up all of that glucose that was available in the body, and they need another energy source. We're going to use that stored glycogen that you have. Glycogen was just one glucose molecule linked up with the others and stored in either the liver or the muscles. But in that short-term energy need, the body can break down the glycogen into its individual glucose molecules and then use that to fuel its muscles and provide nutrients. We're going to take the next two a little out of order from our initial list, and we're going to start with the nucleic acids. The function of nucleic acids is to store and transfer genetic or hereditary information. The monomer is a nucleotide, and the polymer is DNA or RNA. Nucleotides are formed out of 3 components: a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. We see here the sugar, the phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base.